Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. It is wildly obvious that this podcast is about psychedelic drugs and the various interdisciplinary nuances of psychedelic research. That said, I want to make it clear to you that I don't produce this content to encourage or endorse the use of drugs at all, but to encourage and endorse education, open conversation, and psychedelic literacy. I do believe that when having open, intelligent dialogue about taboo subjects such as psychedelics can help not only mitigate the potential harms of their misuse, but can also increase the capacity we have as humanity to utilize psychedelic drugs for the betterment of us all as a whole. Also, this podcast is brought to you by the generosity of listeners like yourself via one-time PayPal donations, as well as my patrons on Patreon. Special thanks go out to the patrons whose names are listed in the upper corner of this video on YouTube or listed in the description to this episode, either at jameswjesso.com or on the description for the episode, obviously, in whatever podcatcher you are listening to it. Also, a thanks goes out to Dana and Al for your very generous PayPal donations as of recently. Thank you very much to everyone supporting the show. It wouldn't continue to grow if it wasn't for your generosity, so thank you. If you, the listener, would like to support the show, you can do so by leaving a PayPal donation or by a cryptocurrency donation. And wow, I just got lost in my words. Let's give this one last piece a try. Or you can become my patron on Patreon. Either of those things or any of those things is absolutely excellent, so I thank you for doing so, and links to doing so are contained in the description below this video on YouTube or in the description to this episode on whatever podcatcher you are listening to it on. Otherwise, you could head to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to find out what becoming a patron means and to thankfully and hopefully become a patron. Okay, so not sure why my brain was so scattered when I did that little intro bit, but we are beyond it. And despite how important it is that you know about and support me on Patreon, I also know that you have tuned in to listen to an interview with somebody. This episode is an interview with Paul Austin of The Third Wave, a microdosing expert and a strong contributor to the third wave of psychedelic culture, or we could say the modern psychedelic renaissance that we as a larger culture here in the Western world are undergoing. So let's take a look at Paul Austin's bio. Paul Austin is the founder of The Third Wave. He is committed to changing the cultural conversation about psychedelics through his platform, The Third Wave. Because of his work with microdosing, Paul has been featured in Rolling Stone and Business Insider, with additional pieces in the New York Times, Playboy, and Lifehacker. In June 2015, Paul began his first microdosing protocol. Immediately, he noticed improvements in his energy levels, creativity, and general sense of well-being. The impact of microdosing was so profound on his life that Paul wanted to help others understand how microdosing can be used as a tool for personal growth and understanding. Well, that is Paul. That's the guy we're going to have on the show today. Conveniently, my interview on the Third Wave podcast actually just came out the week before this podcast is releasing. So it's kind of a cool, not so accidental, but somewhat serendipitous releasing of the mutual back scratching that's going on there. But I was really happy with this interview with Paul. We went to some pretty interesting places, not just in microdosing in particular, though we do go there, but the importance of cultivating what Paul calls psychedelic literacy and the impact of cultivating psychedelic literacy will or may have on the sort of general quality of life and the social narratives of the larger Western culture that we are all participating in. I still feel a little bit scattered in the intro, so hopefully in post-production it sounds good, and hopefully following from here, you will enjoy this interview with Paul Austin. Thanks for tuning in. To start it off, Paul Austin of The Third Wave, welcome to the show.
James Jesso of Adventures Through the Mind, thank you for having me.
So you're pretty well known at this point as the microdosing guy, which might be an unfair characteristic because you're so much more than that. But at the same time, it's great branding and it's a great segue. Let's maybe start it off with the obvious question that I have, anyways, which is, are you microdosing right now?
I did microdose this morning. I've been taking these little like psilocybin, very low, almost like at a supplemental dose level. And I've been doing that maybe 3 to 4 to 5 times a week, depending on the day. And I kind of got this inspiration from Paul Stamets,
Mm-hmm.
who was on the Joe Rogan podcast back in November, talking about the ability to, for example, stack microdosing psilocybin mushrooms with lion's mane, which
Mm-hmm.
is a medicinal mushroom. And so that got me reframing and rethinking how to approach microdosing. Because when I originally microdosed, and this is something that I'd like to dig into more in the podcast, or that we could, it's like the definition around microdosing is somewhat nebulous, in that what one person might consider to be a microdose is not what another individual will consider to be a microdose. And when I first started microdosing, there was an acute effect. In other words, I was a little high. There were no visual changes, but my sense of touch, my sense of smell was enhanced. I could definitely notice that I was under the influence of something. And while that was great for the initial round, for now, for where I am, for being in New York, for being under a somewhat high stress situation, I found almost these supplemental doses, kind of like taking a fish oil, have been much easier to integrate on an ongoing basis. So that's where I'm at from a microdosing perspective.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, the Stamets protocol, as I've heard it, said something like 5 days on, 2 days off, which is very different than what's commonly understood as like the sort of the microdosing baseline protocol, which is from James Fadiman. Maybe you could give us uh, an overview specifically of what microdosing is and what microdosing is claimed to be good for.
Sure.
Maybe in
Yes.
two camps. There's the two primary camps, which is microdosing LSD and microdosing mushrooms, and then later I might ask you about some other psychedelic microdosing.
Like analogs or even plant medicines we
Yeah,
could we
yeah.
could get into as well. Yeah, so microdosing is the consumption of what is supposed to be a sub-perceptible dose of a psychedelic. It's usually about a tenth of a regular dose, so it's not typically enough to get you quote unquote high, but it is enough to notice changes over a period of time. And so James Fadiman first wrote about it in the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, which he published in 2012. Chapter 16 was completely dedicated to microdosing. It told the stories of anywhere from 8 to 10 people who had experience with it. And then Jim was on the Tim Ferriss podcast in March 2015, spoke about it in there, and that's when we've seen kind of the whole microdosing craze take off. And what people are noticing is that when they microdose, it seems to be helpful for a few things. It's helpful for social anxiety because it helps to be more extroverted and have more extroversion. It seems to help with creative projects, entering something that I like to call, or not that I like to call, but that's called a flow state, where you kind of get in the zone and lose track of time and space. And then people are also noticing that it helps with depression. So almost as an antidepressant, as a euphoriant, a lot of people are transitioning into microdosing to help with that. So I'd say those are the three main things, like creative projects, social anxiety, and depression. And then there are many, many dozens of anecdotes from people who say that it helps with things from like things related to menstruation. In terms of really heavy menstruation, it can help to reduce it. Things related to like skin irritation and skin issues. Also things related to, for example, I was just talking to one of my business colleagues, and he's like, I used to get cold sores consistently for 3 months, or every 3 months, since I was like 8 years old. And he's like, since I started microdosing, I haven't had a cold sore.
Mm.
And so there also then seems to be something going on with microdosing, in that it has an holistic anti-inflammatory effect. And I think that's largely because it's activating the 5-HT2A receptor, which is both in the brain and the prefrontal cortex, which is tied to its ability to help with creativity. But we also have serotonergic receptors in our gut. And so the 5-HT2A receptor has been tied to reduction in inflammation, which I think is also why we're seeing it help with some of those things. So that's kind of the general scheme of microdosing in terms of how it started, what it is, and then the benefits that people are noticing from it.
Almost primarily what we've got now is anecdotal reports, right? We don't have any broad, sweeping, qualitative analyses of people doing self-reporting project or anything like that coming out yet.
Well, we have Jim Fadiman and Sophia Korb. They published a study about a year ago, right around Psychedelic Science last year, where they took data, survey-based data from 1,300 people, and showed that it was likely effective for depression, and that it was likely effective for treatment-resistant depression, and that it was not effective for anxiety. In fact, it can make anxiety worse sometimes, and that for everything else, they didn't really know. PTSD, addiction, other issues. I forget what some of the other ones were, but those were kind of like up in the air. And since then, there have been a couple research papers that have been published, but really we haven't learned anything new from those papers. What I do know is there has been some research done. There was one team called Eleusis, which is a public benefit corporation owned by a former executive at Goldman Sachs, who was doing clinical research with microdosing in London, but they still have not published any of their research. And then there's a integrative psychiatrist and medical doctor, Dan Engel, who I recently interviewed for our microdosing course that we have, who was involved in a study in California that showed that microdosing was effective at, for example, improving creativity, and they did psychometrics to track that. But again, that has not been published yet either. So there, I think, are things that are bubbling up and percolating, but the only sort of extensive research that's been published is the survey-based stuff that Fadiman and Korb published about a year ago.
Great. I want to really try to cover a lot of the general stuff on microdosing before getting a bit deeper.
Sure.
What is typically looked at, I mean, like quantitatively, what is typically looked at as a standard microdosing dose and usage protocol, and in particular to LSD and to psilocybin mushrooms?
Yeah, so LSD is typically anywhere from 6 to 20 micrograms, and then, or Jim might even say 5 to 18, but anywhere from like the 5 to 20 range, somewhere within that. And then psilocybin mushrooms, typically 0.1 to 0.5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. And probably some people at home are thinking, that seems really high for a microdose, but again, that's to cover the whole range of people who are becoming interested in this, because microdosing, like other psychedelic use, is largely personal. In other words, what is effective for individual A is likely going to be different for individual B for a number of reasons. A lot of people who are microdosing are taking other pharmaceuticals, which can sometimes blunt or potentiate the effects of microdosing. Obviously, people who weigh more are going to need probably slightly more than someone who weighs less. But also, like someone like me who has a bit of a stronger, my ego is a bit stronger. It takes a little bit more to have an effect on me, whereas other people who are very sensitive and very open and very feeling oriented, they're going to need less. So a lot of it is about calibration. In other words, okay, I'm going into this experience for microdosing. Now, how do I calibrate the dose level to initiate the sort of experience that I want to have, both the day of, but also on a long-term basis, which is where the protocols come into play. So we've already talked about two of the protocols. The Fadiman protocol, which is 2 times a week usually. It's you dose on day 1, you feel the afterglow on day 2, you go back to baseline on day 3, and then you dose again on day 4. And again, from my perspective, this seems to be more oriented towards people who are feeling the acute effects of the microdose, meaning when they take the substance, they notice the day of some significant change. They're slightly happier, they have more energy, their sense of touch or smell is enhanced, and that protocol seems to be better for those kind of acute, maybe slightly higher effects. Whereas I think the Stamets protocol, which we already spoke about, 5 times a week, and I can't remember if it was 5 days on, 2 days off, or if it's like 3 days on, a day off, 3 days on, a day off. I don't I don't remember exactly. But from my perspective, again, that seems to be more oriented towards the supplemental dose, almost like taking a fish oil, where you're understanding there are things going on in the background, processes going on where, because of the impact of microdosing, we might be creating new neuronal connections, or it might be helping to reduce overall inflammation, or it might be helping with energy levels just on an ongoing basis. But there's no acute effects the day of, and the changes that you do see tend to show up over an extended period of time. And I think that is a good paradigm through which to look at the overall microdosing experience is, I think for people who maybe struggle with depression or some of these other functional medicine issues that develop, they seem to be more oriented towards the fenphen protocol, or at least this is where I see it going. Whereas people who are more interested in the holistic effects, maybe they're already pretty healthy and they just want the betterment of well-being, it seems like the really, really low dose levels from a microdosing perspective might be more effective for them. And that's the beautiful thing about microdosing is right now it is a matter of self-experimentation because we don't have a lot of the research yet. So a lot of the people who are getting involved with this are just sort of doing the best they can with the information that they have. And so it's more or less this massive experiment in citizen science where people are acting as their own guinea pigs. They're taking autonomy over their own experience. They're making intentional decisions to pursue a microdosing protocol, and they're living with that experience, whether it's positive or negative. And I think for me, that's the most exciting aspect of microdosing is it's taking the traditional pharmaceutical model of, okay, here's just a pill, go ahead and take it, listen to me because I'm a doctor, to, wait, we don't have any authorities besides a psychologist, Jim Fadiman. He's not a clinical psychologist, he's just a psychologist. And then myself, who's an entrepreneur, who are curating this information for us. So in a way that even empowers the individuals to go, well, I need to go and find out as much information as I can. And so I think that's one of the most beautiful aspects of this whole microdosing phenomena is the autonomy aspect, the ownership aspect. People feel empowered to actually change their habits, to change their decisions, to live healthier, better lives.
Yeah, I really, I would echo the importance of this cultivation of health sovereignty, and I'm personally involved in the microdosing movement in the sense that I microdose, and obviously I run this podcast, so I'm involved with some of the data around it, but maybe not as immersed as yourself, helping a lot of people through their microdosing, like toddlership, like getting into their knowledge and how to take care of themselves. But yeah, health sovereignty I think is an extremely important topic. Now, I understand that objectively, the results of microdosing, say LSD or psilocybin, are pretty much the same. But subjectively, I've noticed that there is a difference to how these things arise and what they each seem to offer slightly separately, although overlapping on a lot of the end results. What have you gotten from subjective reports of people that might help to characterize the differences between, say, microdosing LSD and microdosing psilocybin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of my understanding is on a more intuitive level, both from obviously reading the anecdotal reports and then just talking with people, and also from my personal experience, and also noticing just general trends that are going on in terms of who is becoming attracted to LSD microdosing versus psilocybin microdosing. So I think first in terms of the differences, LSD lasts twice as long as psilocybin. So a full dose of LSD usually the journey will be at least 10 to 12 hours, whereas with psilocybin it tends to be closer to 5 to 6. And so there's that significant difference right away. So how that might play out then in someone's experience is, for example, if they struggle with insomnia and they want to start microdosing, well, don't microdose LSD, because it's going to be a lot more racy and energetic. And I remember talking to Roland Griffiths about this very topic about a year and a half ago. And Roland is the primary investigator of the Johns Hopkins trial. So he's really been, the forerunner in all the psychedelic research that's been going on in the United States specifically. And I remember him telling me that LSD was slightly more active or it had a larger effect or something of that nature on the dopaminergic system. Mm-hmm. In other words, when you take LSD, there's more dopamine that's released than if you take psilocybin, which then explains its impacts and effects in terms of having more energy and being slightly more racy. And I think that also explains then the way that people are using, for example, microdosing LSD compared to psilocybin. It seems like the type of people who are becoming attracted to microdosing LSD, and this is myself included, are more oriented towards doing external work. So they want to take a substance that's going to help them to better navigate, better curate, kind of take ownership over their external world and change it as they wish to change it. So this comes to light in creative projects. So a lot of people, we see this with programmers, software engineers, people in Silicon Valley. A lot of them are microdosing LSD to help with creative projects, extroversion. We also see this with social anxiety, where a lot of people are microdosing LSD so that when they go out in social situations, they're slightly more sociable, they're easier to connect with, and it has that sort of energetic, external-facing perspective. Whereas it seems like with psilocybin, it seems to be much more internal. And I notice this is the case with me as well. Like whenever I microdose with psilocybin at slightly more noticeable levels, I just want to do kind of internal emotional work. I think about the relationships in my life. I think about my family, my friends. I think about how I'm doing actually, or how I'm being, rather than like this is the next thing I need to get done. And psilocybin mushrooms seem to be better at cultivating that kind of introspective understanding of ourselves. I think one more note to add to that as well is, with a lot of people who are microdosing, many of them are, they're sick of the old system, so to say. And I think this is in particular people who are microdosing who have maybe previously tried pharmaceuticals and nothing has worked. And so it seems like a lot of people are also becoming interested in microdosing psilocybin mushrooms because they're sick of the old system, which was a synthetic pill that we feed to you. And so LSD, I think, reminds some people of that sort of synthetic nature. So they're also orienting themselves towards, quote unquote, plant medicines because they believe it will have a more holistic effect in terms of the healing process. Whether or not that's true, I won't speak to. From my understanding, the overall impacts are mostly dictated by the intention and the objective as to why someone becomes interested in microdosing. I think these differences that we're talking about are just nuanced in nature, and that the overall impact is largely the same, whether someone is microdosing LSD or microdosing psilocybin. In other words, the microdosing experience gives people a deeper understanding of self. It helps them with confidence and with being more present. And I think it also, those two. It helps them with a greater sense of self, autonomy, and then also more presence and confidence in specific situations. And then the nuance between the two is just a nuance. Mm-hmm. And that's just my perspective, though. That's just my take on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, this comment that you made about people feeling hesitant to continue embracing the old model, we'll call it like biological psychiatry. Oh, you don't feel good? There's a problem with your brain, the machine. Here's a chemical. It's like a tool that'll go in to make your machine start working better so that you can get back to the assembly line. That understandably, I mean, to me, it's absolutely ludicrous, this idea, and just completely divorced from like the larger interdisciplinary science of the nature of mind and the nature of psychology. But I could see people wanting to gear away from that. But I've also heard criticisms of the microdosing movement, which I'll pose to you, that I think sort of almost confront this idea, but from a larger perspective rather than specifically just biomedicine, but culturally, which is something along the lines of, back in the day, whenever that day was, people were taking LSD and they were taking psychedelics to totally remap their sense of self, to completely, the Timothy Leary idea of dropping out. And even if we were just to exclude the dropping out thing, typically psychedelics were being used to increase a greater connection with, the spiritual nature of reality. Nowadays, we're in a situation where it seems like the apex use of LSD and psilocybin at this time, the most popular use is to, hey, if I take this, I'll be a more productive worker and I could be a more effective member of my corporate team, probably make more money, climb the corporate ladder, and never have to really change or confront anything all that difficult about myself. I can just optimize the life I'm already in. How do you feel about the criticism that, microdosing is sort of, I don't know how to formulate this criticism because I'm not necessarily on the supportive side of it, but I want to unpack that a little bit about,
Yeah.
are we going to lose something really precious if we just start using psychedelics as just tools to be better agents in the same machine that's just absolutely devastating life on this planet?
Yeah, well, I think this is a deep and difficult question, and it's a question that I've thought about and that I've talked about on podcasts before. And from my perspective, I understand the criticism, particularly in the psychedelic subculture of the developing microdosing movement, because, like you said, from these high dose experiences, we have paradigm shifts where we do have to confront, for example, our shadow side, as we spoke about on the podcast that we did on mine. Confronting the shadow side, being able to integrate that is important. And does microdosing really do that? Well, not really, because it's not putting you in that deep, vulnerable state. At the same time, and maybe this is just what I'm oriented towards, I like to focus on larger objectives. And I think from my perspective, the importance of general psychedelic literacy outweighs the ideal of needing to use psychedelics in a specific context and way. In other words, because of how approachable microdosing is, because it is subperceptible, because it doesn't make you trip, there are more and more people who are now considering and engaging with the topic of psychedelics who never did previously. And I think from my perspective, that's much more important and critical than the conversation of, well, are they using it for the right purpose? Because all of the psychedelic use, whether it's microdosing or high doses, is happening within a larger cultural container. And I think the larger cultural movement of what we see developing is orienting towards social entrepreneurship. It's orienting towards a kind of a deep understanding that we've dug ourselves into a hole and now we need to fix something about it. And I think with people who are microdosing, while you definitely have, the financial bankers and you have, people who maybe work in a corporate workspace who are doing it, by and large, most of the people who I know are microdosing are creative entrepreneurs. They're people who are starting their own projects, they're freelancers, they're consultants. Many of them have already transitioned out of the old model. They're not utilizing microdosing to hold tighter onto this old model that we find to be destructive. A lot of people who are microdosing are utilizing it to build the new model that we're all so desperately seeking. Because as Charles Eisenstein said, we're between stories at the moment. We have the old story of separation, of disconnection, and we have this new story of interconnectedness and togetherness. But all the infrastructure that we operate on and work within as society is all built on the old story. And so I think it's fascinating that the people who are building the new story, people who are involved in blockchain, who are involved in the tech scene, who are involved in even things like artificial intelligence, because ultimately I'm an optimist, and I think a lot of the developing technology will empower and liberate us. It won't make us slaves. I think the fact that those people are utilizing a substance like a psychedelic to facilitate higher levels of creative output, to just generally live better lives, I see that as a very positive development. And I mean, this is something I even will make sure I address and emphasize with, for example, talks I give about microdosing at business conferences. Is microdosing isn't about being more productive. Microdosing is about efficacy. It's about effectiveness. It's about understanding that creativity is the most valued element of the business world, or will be the most valuable element of the business world in the 21st century, because a lot of these tasks that we've always done, that rely on convergent thinking, that rely on just doing things, a lot of those tasks are going to be taken over by automation and artificial intelligence. So if we can utilize a substance to facilitate higher levels of creative output, and we can do that within a cultural container that understands the importance of quality of life. And I think this gets back to, again, the cultural norms that are developing, where there are more and more people who are recognizing that financial wealth and attaching happiness to financial wealth is not working. It's bullshit. And more people are realizing that experiential wealth, that the sense of relationship with friends, with community, with the earth, traveling, whatever else it might be, those are more valuable, these moments that we have. And why not then use a tool that enables higher levels of creativity so we can be creative as we need to be, and then with the free time that we have, we can enjoy it as we see fit. And so I think that's the transition that we're going through. I think it's, transitions are always murky. They're never ideal. There's always compromises that need to be made. But from my perspective, again, the developing microdosing trend is by and large very positive, for all the reasons that I just mentioned and discussed.
Yeah, excellent. Absolutely excellent way of addressing that criticism, Paul. Thanks. Let's unpack something else. And I think it was definitely contained in what you were just saying there, but maybe we could talk about it in a little bit more detail, which is psychedelic literacy. I've been hearing you talking about that more and more, and I think it's an excellent idea. I've been working on an essay recently, and I was basically trying to unpack the importance of psychedelic literacy, but I didn't understand that until I had heard you say it, and it was like, ching, like, oh yes, that's the word, that's the term. So could you unpack that a little bit more for us here?
Yeah, actually, that term just kind of came to me as well a couple weeks ago. A lot of the the focus of what we've done to the third wave has been to change the cultural conversation around psychedelics by providing educational resources. And so I was working on, and obviously then we lead with microdosing as the public-facing brand, because that gets the most people as possible to engage with the topic of psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So I was preparing for a talk in Switzerland a few weeks ago, and it might have been feedback I got from a friend, or it might have been just an idea that came, but it's this idea of how literate we are about psychedelic substances. How much do people actually know about psychedelics? And unfortunately, it's still very, very low. Most people still think psychedelics are addictive. They're not. They're anti-addictive.
Well, feeling really good about your life, and like you've resolved, deep-seated, historical traumas, and now you can feel free to laugh and smile and value relationships, can be pretty addictive.
That is true. It can be something that's pretty beautiful. But it does have that. It's anti, and so like a lot of people, what's happening is around psychedelic literacy, you have more and more people who, for example, understand that cannabis is now a medicine and that it's becoming legalized. And so now all of a sudden people are like, well, everything I thought I knew about cannabis, that it's a gateway drug, that I don't know, whatever else you want to say about it, actually is not true. And this, probably started to develop around 10 years ago. And now I would say that most of the Western world has basic literacy about cannabis. Basic. They probably will know that, for example, cannabis use can help with the opioid crisis. They probably know that cannabis is less dangerous than alcohol. They probably know that cannabis is not a gateway drug. Basic literacy. People still don't have that about psychedelics. And that is a tremendous issue. Because if these substances are to ever become integrated into our culture, which I think a lot of people in the psychedelic movement, that's the larger objective. I mean, you talk to people at MAPS, and the whole reason they're medicalizing MDMA is to eventually be able to regulate it and legalize it. Mm-hmm. And so if that's to happen, the approach so far of the psychedelic space, out of necessity more than anything, has been to keep psychedelics within institutions because they are such naturally chaotic substances, which is why the common narrative and the media narrative and everything was largely focused on the research that's been done on high dose psychedelic use, which kind of ties into the last question and why microdosing has created and stirred quite a controversy in the psychedelic space, because it has caught most of the media and attention, and that makes researchers uneasy because it's not grounded in clinical research, which is another topic that maybe we can dig into. I lost my train of thought.
Psychedelic literacy.
So psychedelic literacy. So then when we look at, okay, what's going to happen when we start to bring this out of institutions? What's going to happen when we start to bring this out of academia? How do we ensure that we have a culture that's adequately prepared to understand and work with these substances if they choose to do that? And since education and literacy, it's not like a quick thing. It's not like a 3-year thing or a 5-year thing. It takes a while. It's time to start having those conversations now about how can we be as intentional as possible about increasing the literacy of particularly a Western culture around psychedelic substances. And again, tying back into microdosing, it's one of my core beliefs that I think microdosing is the best way to do that. Amplifying the message of microdosing is the best way to increase psychedelic literacy, which then helps to create a culture that's more comfortable with the fact that psychedelic substances can become regulated and legalized.
I would definitely say that microdosing is the easiest, most accessible, and safest way to start the journey of exploring psychedelics. So I think you've definitely nailed it there. You had said you had paused in making a comment about psychedelic research, and you said that's a different topic. We can unpack that later. Why don't you go ahead and unpack that right now?
What was the context?
I don't fully remember. I just made a comment to put a pin in my mind.
It was about the divide that we're seeing in the psychedelic space because of microdosing. Mm-hmm. And it's partly, I've been responsible for that. I'd say more than anyone. Jim Fadiman has been responsible for that. And it's made a lot of people, a lot of established researchers and institutions very uneasy because microdosing doesn't have the clinical research to back its efficacy, so they're concerned about a backlash because of that. And this speaks to the difference between someone who works in academia and institutions and someone like myself who is an entrepreneur. And I think that difference is the underlying set of assumptions that I think a lot of people in institutions we're going on is that to legitimize psychedelics, because a lot of this comes back to psychedelic legitimacy. Mm-hmm. How do we legitimize psychedelics? To legitimize psychedelics, we have to do clinical research. It's the best way, it might be the only way to show that we can actually utilize these substances so we can get past the regulatory framework of the FDA, et cetera, which is why the whole narrative around research has developed that way. Because back when, Bob Jesso convened a meeting at the Esalen Institute in the mid-90s and brought in a number of figures, they wrote this up and they said, let's do this. This is the best way to do it. It's worked really well so far, extremely well. But what microdosing has done is it's shown that there can actually be positive press and acceptance of psychedelics without any clinical research. In other words, people are more than willing to take psychedelics, even if there's no research involved, as long as there are credible stories around their use. Now, with that being said, I want to orient and I want to kind of reorient and say the research has been fundamental in laying a foundation for that. In other words, if the microdosing phenomena had just developed out of thin air without any of the research that we've done so far, it would have been tossed to the side as well. Mm-hmm. So the research has been absolutely fundamental in establishing that foundation. But what's going on with microdosing is it's now showing that there are a myriad of ways to legitimize psychedelics from a cultural perspective. And I think that's been difficult for people who have been working in this for the last 20 years to integrate and understand. And I think that has then led to this divide. And this is only going to continue to happen as psychedelics gain legitimacy, because whereas we're some of the first entrepreneurs to get into this space, I talk with people on a regular, consistent basis who are also getting into this. I mean, I probably have calls once a week. And whether that's a retreat model, whether that is doing, clinical work, whether that is setting up, functional medicine kind of coaching that utilizes psychedelics, whether that's looking at how do we develop a microdosing product that the DEA will approve so that we can sell. There are so many different things that are developing. And so I think that speaks to this maturation of the psychedelic subculture from being a subculture to being something that's mainstream. So this divide, this disagreement, I think ultimately is extremely healthy, but it's also led to, I think, it's led to some kind of like finger pointing. It's led to some behavior that I would consider to be not all that healthy, to be quite toxic. It's also led to other divides. We're seeing something now where, because of what Compass Pathways is doing, which is an organization in the UK who is starting clinical trials with psilocybin mushrooms, they're backed by Peter Thiel, who's the co-founder of PayPal, because they're trying to develop a for-profit model around psychedelics. There's been a slew of people in the psychedelic space who have now signed a petition basically saying we totally disagree with this and we shouldn't allow it. So now, as you have, it's on chacruna.net. I don't know the exact name of it. It's a really interesting petition. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens as psychedelics become above ground, because, to be frank and to be honest, I think a lot of people who started this movement, they were coming at this from, and this is an ideal. Like, this is what we want to accomplish. And I think what's actually going to happen is when you start to have the economic forces that develop around psychedelics, the reality of the situation is going to be much different. In other words, psychedelics will prove tremendously useful. They're going to help a lot of people, but there will likely be some sort of pharma intervention. There will likely be some sort of patentable substance that some people will end up using, at least in the short term. I think in the long term, I'm still optimistic in that we can democratize education, because, again, the best way to counteract potential capitalist forces that are coming in to co-opt psychedelic medicine is to provide as much education as possible, because it's really fucking easy to grow your own mushrooms.
Yep.
It's really fucking easy. And if people have that education and knowledge, they don't need to pay $10,000 to go into a clinical center to get treatment. They can literally pay $5 to grow their own mushrooms and then get a friend to come sit for them, or a therapist online that they find to sit for them. And so, that's another way to develop that. So that's kind of the rift that we're seeing. And I think it's an interesting conversation, and a conversation that I'm curious to see how it develops, just in terms of what happens when the psychedelic subculture, which had its foundational principles and values rooted in the counterculture of the 60s, doesn't become the subculture anymore, and instead starts to have influential voices, even like myself. Like, at heart, I'm a hippie, but the way I dress, the way I act, the way I speak, the fact that I'm talking about microdosing in business context, I do not come across that way. And so it'll be interesting to see how this all develops, and how that tension is held in a way that's still productive, that allows us to reach this quote unquote end goal of what I believe to be psychedelic literacy and regulation of these substances, so that people can choose to use them as they see fit.
Yeah, great. I definitely think one of the last comments you made there about the democratizing of education, I think, is really important. And again, like I said, but before I had heard the term, like, this is really exactly what I was working towards, or am working towards, with this podcast. And I know you've just expressed something that you're working towards with your podcast. It's called the Third Wave Podcast.
The Third Wave podcast.
Yeah,
that's
and
correct.
then the website, The Third Wave, which is an excellent educational source on psychedelics of all types, and especially microdosing. So I think it's great. I think it's great the opportunity we have with digital communication technologies to basically, put stuff out there, because I think that when it comes to something as uniquely personal as the psychedelic experience, we need to be careful that we don't confine its potentials by locking it into institutional values. That said, we would be hard pressed to find good benefit if we didn't have some form of cultural substrata to be like the boat that we're in when we're out in the chaos. So having this, you're talking about this divide, and it's interesting because I keep finding myself somewhere in the middle and trying to make sense of both ends and then present that type of content here on the show. So yeah,
And I
excellent.
think that's what we share in common as well. It is how do we straddle that? How do we build a bridge between these conversations so there's still some sort of unity between the disparate parts of the psychedelic space that are developing? And obviously, there are always going to be disagreements, but that's something that I've come to understand and recognize in working in the psychedelic space. Is even if there are disagreements, most people are still supportive, they're understanding, and they'll tell you what you think you need to hear. And there's an acceptance that, I think a lot of people in the psychedelic space, on the whole, we have diminished egos, we could say. And I
I
and
don't
I
know. I don't know about that, man. Like, I think that we might have a greater sense of understanding, of compassion, and a greater sense of, like you had mentioned earlier, like the importance of having of healthy relationship dynamics is sort of like, a high valued social capital. Maybe I'm reducing it in a weird way there, but I don't know. I've met some giant egos that have been in the psychedelic scene for a long time, and I wonder about whether or not I'm one of those egos, and I just haven't been checked yet. But I see the point, but I just, at the same time, it's like I know some giant psychedelic egos that are still good people, and we have good conversations, and we don't agree, but the ego is big.
so yeah, and then the question becomes, and I should have added kind of like a disclaimer in there. Egos are present, particularly in people who orient from a more leadership or public speaking perspective. So yourself, myself included, I can think of more than a handful of other people in the psychedelic space as well who probably have a big ego. But then the question becomes, and I won't speak for you, but I sometimes have issues. The question becomes then, how well can we integrate feedback? So in other words, how flexible is our ego? And I think that's more the point that I was getting to, is again, from my understanding, a lot of people in the psychedelic space are pretty honest with themselves. And there's a higher capacity and ability to take honest feedback and to integrate it to facilitate positive change because of our experience with psychedelics. Again, this is just my perspective.
Hey,
and
I
my
completely agree.
but
Yeah, I completely agree. Maybe not
but
as like a hard and fast rule, but as
right.
as a general sense, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, anyone who's taken a lot of psychedelics for long enough recognizes that one of the greatest lessons that it gives is, hey, just because this hurts doesn't mean that it's wrong. You should probably listen. You should probably
Right.
shut up and pay attention. And so I definitely see that too.
Right. Yeah, and that's the message that we get from the psychedelic experience itself. That sometimes those lessons that we need to understand are, we have this ego that gets in the way of letting us see how things really are, and that's always been my, like my early psychedelic experiences were all about that. It was about that sense of being honest with myself about, like, if I wanted to live the life that I envisioned for myself, that I would have to do significantly different things if that was going to be facilitated. And that was catalyzed through, these high dose psychedelic experiences, mostly LSD, but also mushrooms, that really helped me on that path. Yeah.
Yeah, myself as well. I think actually my early psychedelic experiences were very, this might not be the best word, but sort of trivial and superficial and escapist.
Mm.
but laid the groundwork for my later use, which was much more about developing and even structuring my whole psychedelic philosophy on psychology and the nature of mind around emotional honesty and the importance of emotional honesty, vulnerability, and transparency.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly what we spoke about on the podcast, is
Yeah.
how then we can utilize mushrooms to get in touch with that vulnerable shadow side.
Yeah. Your podcast.
Yeah. To
Yeah.
open it up, to understand it, and then to integrate it in.
So
Absolutely.
let's slide ever so gently, and I think it's a like a samurai saying, which is like forward always forward, but sometimes forward step takes a 180-degree turn. Uh, Maybe not so dramatic, but I want to get back into microdosing.
Okay.
So, what are the different substances that people that you've heard of as being effective for microdosing? And I mean, you could just bullet point it, wrap off, and what people that you've gotten from, or even from your own experience, seem to suggest or lay claim to the benefit of these other molecules.
Yeah. I mean, you can microdose anything, right? I mean, that's the interesting thing about the topic of microdosing. Cannabis, mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca, ibogaine, mescaline, MDMA, ketamine, bunch of psychedelic analogs. What else could you microdose with? There are probably a few others as well. The primary ones are cannabis, psilocybin, and LSD. Um, we wrote a piece on this on the website in terms of probably avoid MDMA for microdosing, only because we know that consistent prolonged exposure to MDMA can create issues in the heart valve because it activates something called the 5-HT2B receptor, which is tied to heart valvulopathy.
I'm gonna stop your train of thought here because I wanted to zero in on that. Is that not like the 5-HT2B receptor is also one of the most activated receptors by psilocybin, and it's also activated by LSD. And when Dennis McKenna was on the podcast, he had mentioned that although not wanting to be alarmist or anything, there was some serious consideration around whether or not people have to be concerned about possibly negative impact on the heart from microdosing due to the interaction with this particular subreceptor. What do you know about this? What have you heard? Any new updates?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is what we dealt with as well about 6 months ago when this divide happened.
Mm.
So then Hefter published a piece on their website about this exact thing, because they're really trying to orient themselves in a very conservative element, because there is no clinical research on microdosing. And this is my take on it, and I'm not a doctor, but from what I understand, a lot of the assumption was that this could be the case because a lysergamide that was prescribed called fenphen in the late 80s, early 90s as a diet pill was taken off the market because people realized that it was leading to heart issues. And they were taking it every day, I think for up to 6 months. And it was, I want to say, something like 3,000 times the amount that you would take with LSD.
Now,
So
by 3,000 times the amount, dose, and like, that's sort of a shifty thing. You mean like 3,000 times the amount of activity in the 5-HT2B receptors? Because, I mean, LSD is one of maybe the most potent psychedelic known. It takes like absolutely ridiculously tiny amount for an effect. So, I mean, comparing the doses might be difficult, but like, was there a stronger affinity to that particular subreceptor, or was
for
it
the
just a
diet
higher?
pill, or compared to
Yeah, to the diet pill.
I don't know in particular. I'm going to assume that the affinity for LSD was maybe slightly higher. In other words, LSD had a higher affinity for the serotonin receptor. But from what I understand and know, LSD has a high affinity for the 5-HT2A receptor.
Hmm.
And it likely is for the 5-HT2B receptor as well, but I don't think it's as strong as the 5-HT2A receptor. Again, this is my basic understanding. I don't know how true this is. This is just my basic understanding. And that's why I was like, the amount that you're microdosing with LSD is 10 micrograms, and the amount that you're taking for fenphen was something like 30 milligrams. And you were doing it every day, whereas with LSD, it's once or twice a week, usually. Mm-hmm. So is that a concern? Yes. I mean, and that's something that we haven't really talked about, is what are the concerns about microdosing? What are things to be cautious of? I think that's one of them, is we don't have longitudinal data on prolonged exposure to low doses of psychedelics. We have data on the fact that occasional high-dose psychedelic use is perfectly safe as long as set and setting and environment are paid attention to. But we don't have any data to understand, microdosing and whether or not these lower doses are okay. So that's one thing to be considerate of. Again, from my basic understanding, I think there are other things to be more concerned about, like what you eat and your fitness and your health, how much you sleep.
Whether or not you smoke, do you live close to a freeway?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. All of these things, I think, are bigger concerns. And if you microdose then once or twice a week and all those things are pretty dialed in, again, I can't say for a fact, but I think generally speaking, and from some of the other people that I've spoken to about this, doctors and psychiatrists and neuroscientists and whatnot, it seems to be okay. It seems to be like the benefits do outweigh the potential risks. But again, that's something that we don't know for a fact yet, because we don't have that data. We don't have that evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, like you said, the mass citizen scientist movement, they're experiments, and we're experimenting with our own body.
We've been doing this for a while now. People have been microdosing for years now, for 6 years. And granted, it's just starting to take off now. But I don't think, I feel like if this was the case, there would have been at least one person who would come forward and be like, actually, guys, I microdosed for 4 years, did a heart check, and it looks like I have some issues now. Mm-hmm. Nothing like that has happened. There's been no cases of that. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be. That could develop. But I feel like we would have at least seen one or two by this point in time, if that was the case. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what develops. I will continue microdosing personally. I don't have any personal concerns, but I think it is something that anyone who's interested in microdosing should definitely be aware of.
Excellent. Well, I want to maybe finish off with any relevant sort of alternative microdosing chemicals, but maybe just give a space. Are there any other glaring concerns, harm concerns with microdosing that you feel should be heard? Since so far, other than this brief moment talking about the heart valve issue, it's been a fairly microdosed vibe. And if there's any important concerns that need to be heard by the excited listener, I would love to offer space for that.
I assume most of your listeners have pretty extensive experience with psychedelics, or at least some experience with psychedelics. Yeah. So, the basics, like test your drugs, that's really important. I think the only other concerns is to be aware that microdosing can increase anxiety. And so, if you're living in a really busy, stressful city like New York, like I am, then I've noticed that if I try to microdose acid, that it tends to make me quite anxious and make things a little bit worse. And this was kind of
corroborated.
Corroborated? Is it corroborated?
I don't know. I don't know now because we said it so many times.
Read. It's one of those words that you've read but you've never heard before.
Well, I've heard it and said it, but now that it's called into question and you said it multiple times, it doesn't sound like it makes sense.
I was thinking, is it collaborated? It's not collaborated.
I think it's corroborated. I think that's the word.
Okay, so that's what the research showed that Sophia Corbin-Jimfatovan did.
Yeah,
just gonna avoid it. Just avoid the word. That's the research. They showed that it could sometimes make general anxiety a little bit worse, and so that's, I think, one thing to be aware of. And under that same note is, because of what it's doing in the brain, from a neurotransmitter perspective, if microdosing consistently, I think it can also lead to slightly more impulsive behavior, in that you might, even if you're not a manic person, you might be oriented towards making impulsive decisions because you're in a vulnerable mind state. Hold on, there's a fire truck going by. I'm going to mute myself.
This is a big fire truck.
Well, it's New York, so it's like it can't get too. It's like the traffic is
right.
Okay, do you want me to start over? Or?
No, I'll probably just include that because it was hilarious.
Okay. Cool. So, what were we talking about again?
You were talking about impulsive behaviors.
Oh, yeah.
Impulsive tendencies.
Yeah, microdosing can also make you more impulsive. So I would say be just aware of that and be cautious of that. That if you're microdosing consistently, it helps to take a couple weeks off or a month off to kind of go back to baseline, to have a really solid foundation to operate from. I think the other basic concerns to be aware of is the first time you microdose, particularly if you don't have any previous psychedelic experience, do it in a comfortable place, a comfortable setting, almost like you would with a high dose, just because you might not know the effects that it has, and start low. So I kind of say start low, go slow. So start at maybe 5 micrograms, go up to 7 or 8, maybe 9 or 10, up to 12 or 13, and just continue to increase from there. And yeah, I think those are the primary concerns that come to mind about microdosing.
Great. So let's finish off, or at least just before finishing off, with completing the thought you were going through with alternative molecules for microdosing, but maybe we'll just slim it down because of the time, which is that okay, so this is a two-part question. The first one is, what molecule have you been surprised has gotten so much, say, alternative popularity as a microdosing option? And then the second question is, which one for you personally that you experimented with did you find to be a surprisingly pleasant or positive microdosing experience?
So are you talking about like the psychedelic analogs?
Yeah,
potentially.
Okay. Yeah, psychedelic analogs.
Okay, so I've tried both 1P LSD, which is really easy to get in Canada, which I know is where you're from.
Very easy.
Very easy. And then also 4-ACO DMT, which is not DMT, quote unquote. It's just a tryptamine, but it just ends with DMT. So whenever I say to like people who never heard of it before, I'm like, yeah, I'm microdosing 4-ACO DMT. They go, oh yeah, I've heard of DMT. And then I have to be like, it's not.
Yeah, it's much closer to, it's actually much closer to psilocin, which is 4-hydroxy DMT.
Correct.
Actually, not just much closer, it's like way closer. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, it's basically like an analog. Like 1P LSD is an analog of LSD, 4-ACO DMT is an analog of psilocin. And I microdosed with both. 1P LSD is basically the same as regular LSD. I really didn't notice any sort of significant change or difference. But I also only microdosed with 1P LSD a couple times. It's not like I did it a lot. Microdosing with 4-ACO DMT was really interesting because you get, at least for me, I had a lot of the same cognitive clarity, direction, pointedness of LSD, but it also came with that sort of emotional opening up, the emotional resonance, the feeling aspect, where I felt like I could sit, be calm, be present, engage, and not feel rushed or anything like that. So I microdosed with that before I gave this talk in Zurich to try it out. Because what I really like to do before I give talks on microdosing is microdose.
It's so interesting that you experiment with this brand new microdosing thing before you get on stage to talk to some people.
It's great, dude.
It's taking a gamble.
I'm a firm believer in skin in the game. So in other words, if you're going to talk about something and talk about its benefits and its risks and just the fact that people are doing it, it speaks to people on a deeper level if you're doing it yourself.
Yep.
And there's no way to embody that better than getting up on stage in front of them and giving a talk, and then embodying the things that you're talking about: articulation, creativity, reduction of social anxiety, all these things. So that's kind of why I do it, because it's like a meta. a meta thing, and it's worked well for me. I really like to microdose before those talks because I have more confidence, energy, articulation, all those things.
Hmm.
So yeah, those are the two that have worked well for me. I think a couple others that people use are ALD52,
Hmm.
I want to say, and there might be. I feel like there's one or two others that I'm missing that I just can't remember. Do you know of any other analogs that?
Well, I have. Okay, so ALD52 is an interesting one. I've never tried microdosing with it, but it's legally obtainable in Canada, and I have tried a small dose with it of 100 micrograms, which was a very interesting experience. It's 1-acetyl LSD. So the other one that I found interesting, which is people microdosing with 2CD, because 2CD is a synthetic phenethylamine that is like a remix of the mescaline molecule, just like 2CB or 2CE or 2CP or 2CI, but that the active dose range is way higher. So in order to get like a common dose, you're taking 40 to 60 milligrams, where getting to a good strong common dose with 2CB, for example, would be 20. So you could take 10 milligrams and weigh out 10 milligrams of 2CD, and that the 2CD effectiveness, even when you're deep in the experience, feels almost entirely functional, cognitively, like there's very little headspace. So I've heard of people microdosing 2CD for a nootropic effect, and I've actually known about that sort of like in the speculative talk across Reddit and Blue Light and forums like that for years, actually before I'd even heard of microdosing. I had heard of taking smaller doses of 2CD as a nootropic.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Really interesting. So yeah, I haven't tried any of those. I might go for it. That sounds like something fun to do. So thank you for the inspiration.
Yeah, well, I would never encourage anyone to do anything illegal or harmful. And I mean that.
Just to clarify.
I mean that legitimately. Like,
sure.
making the decision to take a psychedelic is a big decision and should be treated with a lot of respect and reverence. That said, I did find 2CD to be an extremely interesting compound. That one time that I took it in that place where it was legal, and I would encourage you to maybe do a little bit more research around it. I think it's a very, very interesting molecule.
Great. I will do that. More research is always necessary. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's finish off. Paul, why don't you tell us where we can find out more about you and your work? You have a podcast, the Third Wave Podcast, an excellent website also called The Third Wave, as well as you do some form of personal consulting for people. So how can we figure out how to get a hold of you and what you do?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start, like if people want to learn more about microdosing, we have a lot of free resources on our website. If they want to go to a deep dive, we also have a microdosing course, and that is with expert interviews. So we've interviewed medical doctors, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, a number of people who are then utilizing this or who have. That's probably the best place to start. There's also more information just about the work that I've done on my own website, paulaustin.co. And finally, this is something that we spoke about. We're also now leading retreats in Amsterdam, one of which I'm leaving for tomorrow. So we're recording this on April 10th. Yeah. April 10th. So I'm leaving tomorrow, and I'll be in Amsterdam for a couple of weeks, and we're leading retreats there as well, and that's called Synthesis. So probably the best thing is just, if people are interested in learning more either about microdosing or general psychedelic education, to go to our website, to get on our email list, and then to stay tuned from there.
Excellent. The listeners know this, but all those links can be found in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. And also, you're doing this with Martin from High Existence. Is that right?
Correct. The retreat in Amsterdam. Yep. We're kind of co-leading it. Yeah. And this will be the first one. So I'm really excited to see what transpires and what happens.
Great. Well, he's an excellent guy. So good teamwork there.
Absolutely.
Paul, thanks for being on the show here, and I look forward to maybe catching up one day again.
Absolutely, James. Thank you so much for the platform you provide and for the excellent interview. And it was an honor and a pleasure to speak to you.
And cut. Hey, I didn't ask you about it, but you provide a microdosing kit, don't you?
Yeah.
Through the third
Yeah,
wave.
yeah. We talked about it on Facebook a little bit.
Yeah.
So
That was our first interaction, I think.
correct. Yeah.
I'll tag this on at the end because I'm still recording.
Okay.
What is the microdosing kit and how can people get one?
So the microdosing kit it's like distilled water, which is what you'd put the microdose in, and a little scissors if you need to cut the tab. It comes with an LSD testing kit, so you can test to make sure that you have real LSD. It comes with a little syringe so that you can measure the distilled water properly if you're microdosing volumetrically. And then it also comes with latex gloves, so that if you're picking up the substance, you don't get your stuff on it. Mm-hmm. And that's just the basic kit. And it's basically just like a basic kit so that people can get it. It just everything comes in one package for what they need to volumetrically microdose with LSD, and make sure that they have the substance itself. It makes sure that they can dose it accurately, and they can get one on our website if you just search for microdosing kit third wave, or just go to our website, thethirdwave.co/microdosing-kit. I think people should be able to find one.
And it's also like a collectible stamped third wave tin, right? Like it's...
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's also a little collectible. So I actually sent one to Ben Sessa.
Excellent.
He's like, can I get one of those? I have all these other little things on my shelf. I'm like, of course, Ben, we'll send you one.
Yeah. No cool. Yeah. I think that's great. And it's a good way to support what you're doing with the third wave as well. Yeah. So people listening, buying merch is an excellent way to support your favorite podcasts and media outlets, democratized educational outlets. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked what you heard, please share it with a friend. And if you liked it so much you'd like to support the show's growth and sustainability, you can do so by leaving a one-time PayPal or Bitcoin donation. Links to that are in the description to this particular episode. Also, you could become my patron on Patreon, which is a type of community funding platform that works to build an intimate connection between me, the content producer, and you, the content enjoyer, for not only the funding of the production and sustainability of the podcast, my videos, and my written work, but also as contribution to the actual content that I am producing, because you get to ask me questions that I can answer in different videos, or just generally connect with me on the monthly video Skype calls, and just kind of really feel like I'm not just a disembodied person on the internet, and you're not just another disembodied person on the internet. So big thanks to my patrons currently, and I invite you, if you're not yet a patron, to please become one by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso or looking in the description to this episode. Please be sure to stay up to date with what I am doing beyond the podcast by following me on social media at Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at James W. Jesso. And if you're really interested in staying up to date on the nuances of what I'm doing, you could also sign up for my newsletter, which you can find at jameswjesso.com or linked in the description below. That's it for me. I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Thanks for tuning in and for giving my strange, linguistic, dyslexic, strange, weird mind today in the intro and the outro. Yeah, see you soon. Bye.